Her scream pierced the quiet neighborhood like a siren in the night. "Stepmom poured boiling water on my hands." The little girl's desperate cry would change everything that day. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Frost clung to the window panes of Evelyn's modest kitchen, creating delicate patterns that Lucy might have admired under different circumstances. Instead, the 12-year-old's hands trembled as she arranged teacups on the worn wooden tray, her movements careful but clumsy with anxiety. "Can't you do anything right?" Evelyn snapped, her voice cutting through the steam rising from the kettle. "Your father will be home any minute, and you're fumbling like a toddler." Lucy Marshall bit her lower lip, trying to steady her hands. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the china cups, her stepmother's prized possessions, remnants of a more affluent past. "Sorry doesn't set a proper table," Evelyn retorted, smoothing her apron with practiced precision. The woman's face, once considered pretty by the townspeople, had hardened over the years into sharp angles of perpetual disappointment. When Lucy accidentally clinked 2 cups together, Evelyn's patience evaporated like the steam curling above them. She grabbed the kettle, intending to finish the task herself, but in her frustration she swung it too forcefully. Boiling water splashed across the table, catching Lucy's outstretched hands. The pain was immediate and searing. Lucy recoiled with a scream that seemed to tear from the depths of her soul. "Stepmom poured boiling water on my hands!" she shrieked, the words bursting through her tears as she backed toward the door. Her cry echoed down the narrow street, carrying far beyond their thin walls. Outside, Jonathan Albright paused mid-stride. The millionaire had been making his way to the church's winter charity meeting, wrapped in both his expensive wool coat and his customary emotional reserve. Something in the child's voice, raw terror and genuine pain, pierced through years of carefully constructed indifference. Jonathan had walked these cobblestone streets countless times, nodding politely but maintaining his distance from the whispered dramas of his neighbors. Yet this cry was different. It wasn't the typical sound of a child's tantrum or playful shriek. It carried the unmistakable weight of truth. Without conscious decision, he found himself turning toward the modest house, his polished shoes crunching on the icy pathway. The philanthropist abandoned his scheduled route, his briefcase of donation paperwork clutched tightly in his gloved hand. "It was an accident," Evelyn's voice carried through the partially open door. "Stop making such a fuss!" The wealthy man quickened his pace, ignoring the curious glances from passers-by. Town gossip would surely follow. Jonathan Albright involving himself in someone else's domestic affairs was unprecedented. But for once he didn't care about maintaining appearances or the whispers that would trail in his wake. Something about that desperate cry had awakened something long dormant within him. A promise made, perhaps, or a duty unfulfilled. Whatever it was, it propelled him forward with unexpected urgency toward a confrontation that would change multiple lives forever. Jonathan Albright burst through the front door without knocking, following the piercing cry that had cut through the winter morning. The kitchen was thick with steam and tension as he entered, his normally composed demeanor replaced by urgent concern. "What's happening here?" he demanded, his gaze immediately falling on Lucy, who stood trembling against the counter, her small hands angry red and clutched protectively against her chest. Tears streamed down the child's face as she looked up at Jonathan with a mixture of relief and terror. She poured hot water on me," Lucy whispered, her voice barely audible. Evelyn whirled around, a dish towel clutched in her white-knuckled grip. The stepmother's face flushed with indignation as she quickly regained her composure. "Mr. Albright, this is completely inappropriate," she said, stepping between him and Lucy. "My stepdaughter knocked over her teacup and spilled some water. She's being dramatic as usual. Children exaggerate, you know." Jonathan's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene, the upturned teacup, the puddle on the floor, and most tellingly the genuine fear in Lucy's eyes. "Those burns need attention," he said firmly, taking a step toward the girl. "I'm handling this," Evelyn insisted, her voice rising. "You have no right to barge into my home and question my parenting. Lucy needs discipline. She's clumsy and careless, always causing trouble." Outside, curtains twitched in neighboring windows. 3 women had already gathered on the sidewalk, their morning routines abandoned at the first hint of drama. One pointed toward Evelyn's house, whispering urgently to her companions. "Jonathan Albright is in there," one neighbor murmured. "Never thought I'd see him involved in someone else's business." Within minutes, the news spread like wildfire. At the bakery, Thomas paused while kneading dough as customers shared breathless updates. The church secretary phoned 3 parishioners before the hour was up. In the market, shoppers huddled between produce stands, speculating about what might have happened. "Always knew something wasn't right in that house," said one elderly woman, nodding knowingly. "That poor child barely speaks above a whisper at school functions." Back in the kitchen, Jonathan stood his ground despite Evelyn's protests. The philanthropist, usually so careful to maintain his distance from town affairs, found himself unable to walk away. Lucy's wounded hands and frightened eyes stirred something protective within him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. "This isn't over," he said quietly to Evelyn, his voice carrying the weight of his influence. "Those burns need treatment, and I intend to make sure she receives it." The morning after the incident, Evelyn Blackwood was already at work rewriting history. She arrived at the church with a generous donation, her face a mask of practiced concern as she spoke with Reverend Miller. "Lucy has always had a flair for dramatics," she confided, voice lowered just enough that everyone nearby could still hear. "The poor child merely bumped the table while I was making tea." The water barely splashed. The stepmother dabbed at her eyes with an embroidered handkerchief. "I worry about her tendency to exaggerate for attention." By noon, Evelyn's version had spread through town like wildfire. She stood in the marketplace, accepting sympathetic pats on the shoulder from women who whispered how difficult it must be to raise such a troubled child. The social climbing woman had transformed herself from potential abuser to martyred caretaker in less than 24 hours. Meanwhile, Jonathan Albright sat in his study, fingers drumming against his mahogany desk. The philanthropist couldn't reconcile Evelyn's poised explanations with the raw terror he'd witnessed in Lucy's eyes. Something wasn't right, but the town was already taking sides. "Mr. Albright," Clara said, entering with his afternoon tea, "people are talking." "Let them talk," he replied, though his frown betrayed his concern. "They're saying you overstepped, that you embarrassed a respectable woman over a child's tantrum." Jonathan stood and walked to the window. Beyond the manicured grounds of his estate, he could see the town square where several people glanced up at his house before huddling closer in conversation. "I know what I heard, Clara." "I believe you," his housekeeper said quietly. "But this town values reputation above all else. Even yours isn't immune." That afternoon, Jonathan attempted to visit his usual cafe, only to be met with cool stares and whispered comments. The owner, usually eager to serve his wealthiest patron, seemed distracted and uncomfortable. Later, Margaret Thornfield cornered him outside the post office. "Jonathan, darling," she purred. "Such a misunderstanding with poor Evelyn. Perhaps next time you'll think twice before rushing into domestic matters." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Not everyone appreciates a man of your position meddling in their private affairs. That night, alone in his study, Jonathan stared at the town lights twinkling below. His late wife had always managed the delicate dance of social expectations effortlessly. Without her, he felt exposed, vulnerable to the town's judgment. Yet every time he considered stepping back, he remembered Lucy's trembling hands and frightened eyes. The millionaire faced an impossible choice: protect his carefully guarded reputation or follow his conscience to help a child nobody believed. Either way, the cost would be steep. Jonathan Albright pushed open the heavy oak door to his residence, his mind still replaying the little girl's terrified face. The warmth of his home did nothing to thaw the chill that had settled in his chest after witnessing Lucy's distress. He hung his coat with mechanical precision, barely noticing the familiar surroundings. "You look troubled, Mr. Albright," came a gentle voice from the hallway. Clara emerged from the kitchen, drying her hands on her apron. The housekeeper's perceptive eyes studied his face with the familiarity of someone who had managed his household for years. "Is it that obvious?" Jonathan sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. Clara gestured toward his study. "Come sit down. I'll bring you some tea." Minutes later, seated in his leather armchair, Jonathan recounted what he had witnessed at Evelyn's house. Clara listened attentively, her weathered hands folded in her lap. "That poor child," she murmured when he finished. "The town will talk, of course. They always do when someone like you gets involved in other people's business." "I couldn't just walk away," he said defensively. "And you shouldn't have," Clara affirmed. "Some things are worth risking your reputation for, Mr. Albright. But tread carefully. That woman, Evelyn, she sounds like someone who values appearances above all else." Jonathan nodded, grateful for her understanding. "What would you do, Clara?" The housekeeper was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant. "Keep watch from afar. Find ways to be present without confrontation. Sometimes the greatest kindness is simply letting someone know they're not alone. Something in her voice made Jonathan look up sharply. There was a depth of emotion there he rarely heard. "You speak from experience," he observed softly. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she straightened a cushion. "We all have our stories, Mr. Albright. Some wounds never fully heal, but they teach us to recognize pain in others." She didn't elaborate, but Jonathan understood she was sharing something precious, a glimpse into her own heart. "Thank you," he said simply. After Clara left, Jonathan sat alone, contemplating her words. The housekeeper had become more than an employee over the years. She was his moral compass, the voice that often guided him when his own judgment faltered. Her counsel carried the weight of lived experience, though he realized how little he knew of her past sorrows. Tomorrow would bring decisions and consequences. The town would indeed talk. They always did when someone of his standing stepped outside the carefully drawn lines of propriety. But tonight, Clara's quiet wisdom had given him something invaluable, permission to follow his conscience, regardless of the cost to his carefully guarded reputation. Lucy slipped through the bakery's back door, glancing nervously over her shoulder. The red marks on her hands had faded, but the memory of that morning's confrontation with Evelyn remained raw. The smell of fresh bread enveloped her like a warm embrace, a stark contrast to the cold silence that had followed her all day at school. Back again. Thomas looked up from kneading dough, flour dusting his forearms and apron. His smile was genuine, lacking the judgment she'd grown accustomed to seeing in adult faces. "I shouldn't stay long," Lucy whispered, her small frame seeming to shrink further against the doorframe. "Evelyn thinks I'm at the library." The young baker nodded, understanding without needing explanation. "Well, since you're here..." He reached beneath the counter and produced a paper bag. "Day-old sourdough. Still perfectly good, just not fresh enough for the morning customers." Lucy accepted the offering with careful hands. No one had given her anything, without expecting something in return since her father had remarried. "Thank you," she murmured, breaking off a piece and savoring its tangy comfort. "How's the art coming along?" Thomas asked, returning to his work. The rhythmic motion of his hands against the dough created a soothing backdrop to their conversation. "I finished another sketch yesterday." Her voice grew slightly stronger. "Of the old maple tree behind the school." "I'd love to see it sometime," he replied, never pushing, never demanding. For the next half hour, Lucy perched on a flour-dusted stool, watching Thomas work. The bakery, with its warm light and yeasty aroma, became her sanctuary. Here no one scrutinized her every move or twisted her words into weapons. Here she could simply exist. "Business has been slow," Thomas admitted, sliding a tray of rolls into the oven, "but we'll make it through." His determination resonated with Lucy, who recognized in him the same quiet resilience she cultivated in herself. As afternoon light slanted through dusty windows, they shared stories. Thomas of his dreams to expand the bakery someday, Lucy of the birds she'd spotted in the schoolyard. Simple conversations, yet precious in their normalcy. "I should go," she finally said, reluctance evident in her voice. "Evelyn will be suspicious if I'm late." Thomas nodded, wrapping another roll for her to take. "Tomorrow, then?" "Tomorrow," Lucy confirmed, a small smile breaking through her usual caution. As she slipped back onto the street, clutching her paper-wrapped treasure, Lucy felt something unfamiliar stirring within her, a fragile hope that perhaps not all adults were like her stepmother. And in the quiet of his bakery, Thomas found new purpose in the knowledge that his struggling business provided more than just bread. It offered sanctuary to a child who desperately needed one. The first whispers of spring coaxed crocuses through the thawing earth as the town shed its winter cloak. Shopkeepers swept away the last vestiges of snow from their doorsteps, and colorful banners announcing the annual spring fair fluttered in the gentle breeze. For Lucy, the season brought a timid hope that perhaps her life, too, might warm. "You have a gift," Thomas told her one afternoon at the bakery, flour dusting his apron as he peered over her shoulder at the sketchbook she kept hidden from Evelyn. "People should see these." Lucy clutched the book to her chest. "Stepmom would never allow it," she whispered, eyes darting to the door, as if Evelyn might materialize among the bread loaves. The young baker wiped his hands on his apron. "The fair has an art display every year. You could enter anonymously if you're worried." After days of gentle encouragement, Lucy finally relented, selecting 3 sketches, one of the marketplace at dawn, another of an elderly couple feeding birds in the town square, and a third capturing Jonathan Albright's profile as he stood lost in thought outside the church. The morning of the fair arrived with unexpected sunshine. Lucy slipped her unsigned artwork to Thomas, who promised to deliver it to the display. She spent the day helping Evelyn prepare refreshments for the church booth, her secret humming beneath her skin like electricity. By midday, whispers spread through the fairgrounds. "Have you seen those remarkable sketches? Such detail! Who could have drawn them with such feeling?" Jonathan paused before the display, recognition flickering across his features as he studied his own likeness. Clara stood beside him, her weathered hand touching his arm. "The artist sees your kindness," she observed quietly. When Lucy finally managed to escape Evelyn's watchful eye and venture to the art display, she found a small crowd gathered. Her heart nearly stopped when she spotted Margaret examining the sketches, her calculating gaze sweeping the fairgrounds as if hunting for the artist. "There's something familiar about these," Margaret remarked to a companion. "The perspective seems childlike, yet perceptive." Thomas appeared at Lucy's side, beaming with pride. "They love them," he whispered. "You've captured the soul of this town." For one golden moment, Lucy allowed herself to feel the warmth of accomplishment. But across the fairground she caught Evelyn's gaze, cold and suspicious, fixed upon her and Thomas. The woman's lips pressed into a thin line as she abandoned her post at the church booth and began striding toward them. The girl's momentary joy curdled into dread. Her artwork had revealed not just the town's hidden beauty, but her own inner life, a life Evelyn had worked tirelessly to suppress. In exposing her talent, Lucy had inadvertently challenged her stepmother's carefully constructed narrative, and the consequences would surely follow her home like a shadow. Evelyn Matthews paced her kitchen floor, fingers trembling as she clutched her teacup. Lucy's artwork had attracted far too much attention at the spring fair, attention that should have been directed at Evelyn's impeccable hosting of the church fundraiser. The child's unexpected talent threatened to shift the narrative Evelyn had carefully constructed about their home life. "She manipulates everyone with those drawings," she whispered to a neighbor at the market the following day. "Always seeking attention, making things up. You know how children can be." The neighbor nodded, eager to possess this morsel of gossip. By afternoon, whispers circulated through the cobblestone streets. "Did you hear about Lucy?" Apparently, those stories about her stepmother were fabricated for attention. The rumors spread like wildfire through the small town, each retelling, adding new embellishments. At school, Lucy noticed the change immediately. Girls who had admired her sketches now huddled together, exchanging glances when she approached. Her art teacher, who had praised her work so enthusiastically at the fair, now seemed hesitant to meet her eyes. "Perhaps you could tone down the emotional content," the teacher suggested quietly. "Some of your work seems provocative." Lucy clutched her sketchbook tighter. "I just draw what I see," she whispered, but the teacher had already turned away. Even Thomas's bakery, once her sanctuary, felt different. Customers fell silent when she entered, their conversations resuming in hushed tones after she passed. The young baker tried to shield her, sliding extra pastries across the counter with a sympathetic smile, but he couldn't stop the sideways glances and subtle shifts away when she sat at her usual corner table. "Don't let them get to you," Thomas murmured one afternoon, noticing her tears as she sketched. "People forget quickly in this town," but Evelyn ensured they wouldn't forget. She made a point of discussing Lucy's troubling behavior at church gatherings and ladies' teas, expressing concern with just the right balance of frustration and maternal worry. Margaret, ever eager to align herself with potential social advantage, amplified these stories throughout her influential circle. That night, Lucy hid her sketchbook beneath her mattress, her fingers lingering on its worn cover. Drawing had been her only escape, her silent voice. Now even that felt dangerous. The child curled into herself, listening to the creaking floorboards as Evelyn moved through the house below. Every sound made her flinch. The isolation was complete. In a town where reputation was currency, Lucy had become bankrupt overnight. Her only crime, the truth captured in pencil and paper, and a desperate cry that one winter morning that someone had actually heard. The study had grown cold as evening shadows lengthened across the room. Jonathan Albright sat surrounded by cardboard boxes, each containing fragments of a life ended too soon. It had been 3 years since his wife's passing, yet her absence still hung in the air like a phantom scent, familiar yet impossible to grasp. He hadn't planned to revisit her belongings tonight. The day's events, Lucy's frightened face, Evelyn's practiced composure, the town's hungry whispers, had left him restless. Seeking refuge in his study, he'd found himself drawn to the boxes he usually avoided. "Just one," he murmured, opening the smallest container. Inside lay her journals, scarves, and a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. As he lifted them, an unsealed envelope slipped free, bearing his name in her elegant script. Jonathan's hands trembled as he extracted the letter. The paper felt delicate, as if it might dissolve beneath his touch. His wife's words flowed across the page. "My dearest Jonathan, if you're reading this, I'm no longer beside you. I've watched you build walls around your heart, protecting yourself from pain. But walls keep out joy, as well as sorrow. Someday you'll encounter a child who needs the kindness you keep hidden. When that moment comes, remember that compassion isn't weakness. It's the legacy I hope you'll carry forward. Your capacity to care is your greatest strength, though you've always feared it, your greatest vulnerability." The philanthropist pressed the letter to his chest, a sob catching in his throat. She had known him better than he knew himself. The words pierced through layers of carefully constructed reserve, reaching the man he'd been before grief hardened him. Clara knocked softly before entering with tea. She found her employer staring at the letter, tears tracking silently down his face. "She knew," he whispered. "Somehow she knew about Lucy." The housekeeper set down the tray and waited, understanding the importance of this moment. She had served Jonathan long enough to recognize when silence was needed. "I've been afraid," he admitted. "Getting involved means risking failure. What if I can't help her?" Clara nodded. "Fear keeps us safe, but it also keeps us small." Jonathan folded the letter carefully. His late wife's words had illuminated something he'd been avoiding. His reluctance to help Lucy stemmed not from indifference, but from fear. Fear of caring too much, of failing someone vulnerable again. The letter became a talisman in his pocket, a physical reminder of purpose. As moonlight spilled through the window, Jonathan made his decision. He would no longer stand at the periphery of Lucy's suffering. Whatever the cost to his reputation or comfort, he would honor his wife's final request. Margaret Albright saw opportunity where others saw scandal. With the town still buzzing about Lucy's accusations, Evelyn's wealthy cousin recognized the perfect moment to advance her social standing. Dressed in an elegant outfit that cost more than most townspeople earned in a month, she arrived at Jonathan's doorstep with an embossed invitation. "Jonathan, you simply must attend the spring fundraiser at my estate," Margaret insisted, her smile calculated to charm. "I've arranged for Lucy to showcase her artwork." "The poor child deserves recognition, don't you think?" The millionaire hesitated, uncomfortable with Margaret's sudden interest in Lucy's welfare. He had witnessed the socialite's dismissive attitude toward the girl at Misa's previous gatherings. Nevertheless, Jonathan accepted the invitation, hoping it might benefit Lucy. What followed was a masterful campaign of social manipulation. Margaret hosted tea parties, charity auctions, and garden tours, each event strategically designed to position herself at Jonathan's side while keeping Lucy visible but marginalized. The wealthy widow introduced Jonathan to influential community members, always ensuring she appeared indispensable to these connections. "Evelyn means well, of course," Margaret whispered to Jonathan during one such gathering. "But between us, she's never quite understood how to nurture a sensitive child like Lucy." Behind the scenes, Margaret worked to undermine her cousin. She accidentally mentioned Evelyn's financial struggles to key gossips and questioned her parenting abilities with carefully placed concerns. "I worry about Lucy's well-being," she would say with practiced sincerity. "Children need stability, don't they?" Evelyn seethed with resentment as she watched her cousin's influence grow. At the church bake sale, she confronted Margaret near the dessert table. "Using a child to catch a wealthy widower?" "Even for you, that's low," Evelyn hissed. Margaret merely smiled. "Perhaps if you showed more concern for Lucy's welfare than your reputation, you wouldn't be in this position." The rivalry between the cousins intensified with each passing day. Lucy found herself caught in their power struggle, confused by Margaret's sudden attention that felt both flattering and uncomfortable. The girl sensed she was being used but didn't understand exactly how. Jonathan, too, grew increasingly uneasy with Margaret's attentions. During a particularly awkward dinner party, he noticed how she subtly redirected conversations to highlight her charitable work while dismissing others' contributions. When Lucy attempted to speak about her art, Margaret quickly interrupted with a story about her own patronage of a famous painter. The social chess match continued, with Margaret moving her pieces carefully across the board of town opinion, never realizing that her transparent ambition was gradually revealing her true character to the very man she sought to impress. The embers in Jonathan Albright's study had nearly died when Clara knocked softly on the door. She entered with a tray of tea, her usual evening ritual, but tonight her eyes carried a weight beyond fatigue. "You've been troubled since that child's scream," she observed, placing the cup beside him. "I see it eating at you day after day." Jonathan sighed, running his fingers through his graying hair. "I can't explain it, Clara. Something about Lucy's situation won't let me rest." Clara settled into the chair opposite his desk, an unusual breach of their professional boundaries. "Perhaps I understand better than you know." Her voice trembled slightly as she smoothed her apron. 27 years ago I had a daughter. Emma was her name. The millionaire looked up sharply, seeing his housekeeper of 15 years as if for the first time. "She was taken by fever before her 8th birthday," Clara continued, her weathered hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I wasn't there when she needed me most. Working 2 jobs, you see. The neighbor who watched her didn't notice how serious it was until—" She couldn't finish. Jonathan abandoned his desk to sit beside her. "All these years, you never mentioned—" "Some pains we carry quietly," she replied. "But when I heard about Lucy, when I saw your struggle, I recognized something. That child's suffering echoes through me like my own daughter's might have. The confession hung between them, transforming their relationship in ways neither had anticipated." Jonathan suddenly understood Clara's gentle insistence about Lucy, her quiet encouragement of his involvement. "Is that why you've been pushing me to help her?" Clara nodded. "Every child deserves someone who won't look away. I failed Emma by not being present. You have the chance to be present for Lucy." Jonathan thought of his own hesitations, his fear of gossip, his reluctance to disrupt the town's delicate social balance, his terror of emotional entanglement after losing his wife. "I've been a coward," he admitted. "No," the housekeeper corrected gently. "Just a man afraid of more pain. But sometimes, Mr. Albright, the only way past suffering is through it. Yours and hers." They sat in companionable silence as the fire died completely. Something had shifted between employer and employee, a new understanding forged in shared vulnerability. "Tomorrow," Jonathan finally said, his voice steady with newfound resolve, "I'm going to speak with the school headmaster about Lucy's situation." Clara smiled, the ghost of her long-lost daughter seeming to hover in the shadowed room. "Emma would have liked you," she whispered. For the first time in years, Jonathan reached out and squeezed her hand, their shared grief becoming a bridge rather than a barrier. The aroma of fresh bread that once filled the cobblestone streets had noticeably diminished. Thomas stood in his empty bakery, flour dusting his apron as he stared at the vacant tables where customers used to gather. Margaret Evelyn's cousin had been busy. In just 2 weeks, her whispers had spread through town like wildfire, suggesting that Thomas's establishment was unsanitary and that he offered special treatment to that troublesome stepdaughter. "Perhaps we should close early again," Thomas murmured to himself, calculating the day's meager earnings. The young baker had always operated on thin margins, but now his dream teetered on the brink of collapse. Each morning, he still rose before dawn to prepare his specialties, but fewer and fewer townspeople pushed open his door. Lucy noticed the change immediately. Her safe haven was becoming as empty as her stepmother's smiles. "Why is no one coming anymore?" she asked one afternoon, helping Thomas arrange pastries that would likely go unsold. "People listen to those with influence," he replied gently, not wanting to burden the child with adult concerns. But Lucy was perceptive. She had seen Margaret speaking with former regulars outside the church, watched their expressions change, and observed how they'd cross the street to avoid the bakery. Jonathan Albright had also noticed. "Margaret is systematically destroying his business," he confided to Clara one evening, "and all because Thomas showed kindness to Lucy." The spring fair arrived with its usual fanfare of ribbons and music, but Thomas had almost decided against setting up his usual stall. "What's the point?" he asked Lucy when she visited the day before. "No one will buy from me anyway." Lucy's eyes filled with determination. "I'll help you," she insisted. "People need to know the truth." The following day, as Margaret circulated among the fair attendees, she froze at the sound of Lucy's voice. The girl had climbed onto a wooden crate beside Thomas's modest display of goods. "This man," Lucy announced, her voice trembling but clear, "gave me bread when I was hungry and kindness when others turned away. His bakery is clean, his heart is good, and the rumors are lies." The crowd fell silent. Lucy's hands shook, but she continued, "I know what it's like when people believe untrue things about you. Please don't let that happen to him." One elderly woman stepped forward first, purchasing a loaf. Then another followed. By afternoon's end, Thomas had sold everything he'd brought. Margaret retreated, her influence temporarily diminished by the unexpected courage of a child. As Thomas packed up his empty baskets, he squeezed Lucy's shoulder. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You helped me first," she replied simply. Jonathan, watching from a distance, felt a surge of pride. The bakery might survive after all, and so would Lucy's spirit. Jonathan Albright couldn't sleep, his mind preoccupied with Lucy's situation. The girl's fearful eyes haunted him, reminding him of promises made and a letter tucked away in his study. There had to be more to Evelyn's cruelty than simple malice. The following morning, Jonathan visited Eleanor Winters, a longtime family friend who had known Evelyn since childhood. They sat in Eleanor's sunlit parlor, teacups balanced delicately between them. "I need to understand," Jonathan said, his voice low. "Lucy doesn't deserve such treatment, but I wonder what shaped Evelyn into who she is today." Eleanor's weathered face creased with old sorrows. "Evelyn's father was a harsh man, Jonathan. Perfection wasn't requested, it was demanded. The smallest infractions earned severe punishments." She paused, gazing out the window. "I remember seeing bruises she tried to hide. When she spilled tea at a gathering once, the fear in her eyes." Eleanor shook her head. "It was the same fear I see in Lucy's eyes now." The philanthropist absorbed this information silently. It explained so much: the obsessive control, the disproportionate reactions to Lucy's minor mistakes, the fixation on appearances, cycles of pain repeating through generations. Armed with this knowledge, Jonathan drove to Evelyn's house that afternoon. The woman answered the door with her usual composed smile, though it faltered when she saw who stood on her doorstep. "We need to talk," he said firmly. "About Lucy. About you." In the kitchen, the same room where he'd first heard Lucy's desperate cry, Jonathan spoke with careful compassion. "I know about your father, Evelyn. I know what you endured." Her face drained of color. "You have no right—" "I'm not here to judge you," he interrupted gently. "But can't you see? You're becoming what hurt you. Lucy bears the weight of your past wounds." Evelyn's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. "It's discipline, structure, something every child needs." "Is it discipline when you see terror in her eyes? When she hides her artwork because she fears your reaction? That's not structure, Evelyn. That's fear." Something cracked in her carefully maintained facade. For a brief moment, Jonathan glimpsed not the controlling stepmother, but a frightened child who had never escaped her father's shadow. "I don't know how to be different," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It starts with acknowledging the pain," Jonathan replied. "Both yours and hers." When he left, Evelyn remained at the kitchen table, staring at her reflection in a small mirror hanging on the wall. For the first time in years, she truly saw herself, and the ghost of her father looking back at her. Thunder cracked across the darkened sky as rain pelted against the windows of Evelyn's house. Inside, the aftermath of a heated argument still hung in the air like poison. Lucy had dared to mention Jonathan Albright's kindness at dinner, and Evelyn had erupted with unprecedented fury. "You'll be sent to boarding school by week's end," Evelyn had screamed, her face contorted with rage. "I won't have you running to that man with your lies anymore." When Clara arrived at Jonathan's door an hour later, her face was pale with worry. "Lucy's gone," she whispered, clutching a crumpled note in her trembling hands. "Evelyn just called," beside herself. Jonathan read the hastily scrawled words. "I can't stay where I'm not wanted. Please don't look for me." Without hesitation, he grabbed his coat and rushed into the storm. Rain soaked through his expensive clothes within minutes as he called Lucy's name through the deserted streets. The downpour masked his desperate shouts, washing away any traces of the child's path. Word spread quickly through the small town. Thomas closed his bakery early, organizing a search party that combed the marketplace and school grounds. Even Margaret, seeing an opportunity to appear charitable, joined the effort, though she stayed. Conspicuously dry beneath the church portico, directing others instead of searching herself. Jonathan pushed on alone, his shoes sinking into mud as he checked abandoned buildings and rain-soaked fields. His heart pounded with a fear he hadn't felt since his wife's illness. The philanthropist who had spent years guarding himself against emotional attachment now found himself utterly undone by concern for a child who wasn't his. It was Clara who found her, huddled in the back room of Thomas's bakery. Lucy sat shivering among flour sacks, her clothes drenched and her eyes red from crying. "She threatened to send me away forever," the girl whispered as Jonathan wrapped his coat around her shoulders. "She said no one would believe me anyway." Thomas appeared with warm bread and tea, his gentle eyes filled with understanding. "I found her trying to hide when I came back to check on the ovens," he explained quietly. Later, as Lucy slept under Clara's watchful eye at Jonathan's house, the truth emerged in full. Evelyn had been planning to send Lucy away for months, having already contacted a distant boarding school known for its strict discipline. Jonathan stood at his window, watching the storm gradually subside. The revelation left him shaken to his core. This wasn't just about occasional harsh words or momentary cruelty. This was systematic emotional abuse designed to isolate and control. For the first time, he understood with crystal clarity that Lucy needed more than quiet concern or distant charity. She needed someone willing to stand publicly by her side, regardless of the town's whispers or the social cost. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a lingering dampness that clung to the town like a memory refusing to fade. In Thomas's bakery, Lucy sat wrapped in a blanket, her small hands cradling a steaming mug of hot chocolate. The search had ended hours ago, but the fear still lingered in her eyes. Jonathan sat nearby, exhaustion etched across his features, relief visible in every line of his face. Thomas moved between them, placing a plate of freshly baked cookies on the table. "My grandmother's recipe," he said softly, "always helped me feel better when the world seemed too big." Lucy reached for one hesitantly, the ghost of a smile crossing her face. The baker watched her with gentle eyes before glancing at Jonathan. Something unspoken passed between the men, a shared concern for the child who had endured too much. "You know," Thomas began, wiping flour-dusted hands on his apron, "your wife used to come here, Mr. Albright." Jonathan's head snapped up, surprise evident in his expression. "Elizabeth came here?" Thomas nodded, leaning against the counter. "Every Thursday morning. She'd order the same thing, sourdough and 2 cinnamon rolls." His voice softened with the memory. "One day, she noticed me teaching a neighborhood boy how to knead dough. After that, she started bringing books, children's stories about baking, and courage." Lucy looked between them, her eyes widening. "Really?" "She said everyone deserves someone who sees them," Thomas continued. "Someone who notices when they're hurting." He glanced meaningfully at Lucy. "Just like Jonathan noticed you." Tears welled in Jonathan's eyes as pieces of his late wife's life, parts he'd never known, came into focus. Elizabeth had been creating connections he was only now discovering, extending kindness that continued to ripple outward long after she was gone. Lucy reached across the table, her small fingers touching Jonathan's hand. "She sounds nice," she whispered. "She was," Jonathan replied, his voice thick. "And she would have adored you." The baker smiled, watching this unlikely family take shape before him. "That's why I couldn't turn away when you started visiting, Lucy. I saw something in you that reminded me of her kindness. For Jonathan, this revelation was like finding a message in a bottle, a continuation of Elizabeth's compassion reaching across time. In this modest bakery, surrounded by the aroma of fresh bread and gentle conversation, he felt a certainty growing within him. The tangled web of pain and misunderstanding that had ensnared the town could be unwoven, thread by thread, through simple acts of seeing and being seen. Lucy took another cookie, her movements more confident now. "Do you think," she asked hesitantly, "that good things can last, even when everything else is scary?" Jonathan met Thomas's gaze over the child's head. "I'm beginning to believe they can," he answered, "especially when we help them along." The embers in Jonathan Albright's study glowed softly as evening settled over the town. Lucy sat cross-legged on the plush carpet, sketching quietly while Clara arranged a tray of tea and biscuits nearby. The silence between them felt comfortable now, unlike the tense quiet that had dominated their early encounters. "I need to tell you both something," Jonathan said, his voice barely above a whisper. He set down his book and looked first at Clara, then at Lucy. Something I've never told anyone in this town. Clara paused, teapot suspended mid-pour, sensing the weight in her employer's words. Before you came into our lives, Lucy, I tried to foster a child. His fingers traced the edge of his armchair. A boy named Michael. He was 7, had been through 3 homes already. Lucy's pencil stilled against her paper as she looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. I thought I could help him, Jonathan continued, but I was so afraid of doing something wrong, of not being enough. His voice cracked slightly. When he started having nightmares, I panicked. I convinced myself he needed someone better, someone who knew what they were doing. Clara set the teapot down and moved closer, her maternal instincts surfacing. I let him go back into the system. The millionaire's shoulders slumped. I've regretted it every day since. That's why when I heard your scream, that morning, he looked directly at Lucy. I couldn't walk away. Not again. Lucy set her sketchbook aside and moved to kneel beside Jonathan's chair. Were you scared? She asked simply. Terrified, he admitted. Still am, sometimes. Me too, she whispered. All the time. Jonathan reached out hesitantly, then gently placed his hand on Lucy's shoulder. I think maybe that's okay. Being scared doesn't mean we're doing it wrong. Clara dabbed at her eyes with her apron. It means you care enough to worry about getting it right. Lucy nodded solemnly. Evelyn was never scared about taking care of me. She was just angry. Fear and anger can look similar sometimes, Jonathan said thoughtfully, but they lead to different places. Where does fear lead? Lucy asked. To caution, sometimes. To growth, eventually. He smiled slightly. To this room, with you and Clara, if we're brave enough to face it. That night, as Clara tucked Lucy into bed in the guest room that was slowly becoming hers, the girl whispered, I didn't know grown-ups got scared, too. Oh, child, Clara said, smoothing Lucy's hair. Sometimes we're the most frightened of all. Across the hall, Jonathan stood at his window, watching the town lights flicker in the distance. For the first time since his wife's passing, the weight of solitude felt lighter on his shoulders. He was no longer simply a wealthy man fulfilling a charitable obligation. He was becoming Lucy's protector, by choice and by heart. The church pews creaked beneath the weight of the congregation, packed shoulder to shoulder for Sunday service. Jonathan Albright sat beside Lucy, his presence a silent statement of protection that hadn't gone unnoticed by the townsfolk. Clara occupied the space on Lucy's other side, her weathered hand occasionally patting the girl's trembling fingers. Evelyn entered last, her steps faltering as whispers rippled through the crowd. The past weeks had seen a gradual shift in public opinion. Thomas's defense of Lucy at the bakery, Jonathan's increasingly visible support, and the undeniable evidence of Lucy's artistic talent had all chipped away at Evelyn's carefully constructed facade. Reverend Miller's sermon focused pointedly on truth and responsibility. We cannot claim to be righteous while turning blind eyes to suffering in our midst, he declared, his gaze sweeping across the congregation before settling momentarily on Evelyn. The stepmother shifted uncomfortably, dabbing at non-existent perspiration with an embroidered handkerchief. Margaret sat 3 rows behind, leaning forward with barely concealed anticipation, like a predator sensing weakness in her cousin's armor. When the collection plate passed, Evelyn made a show of placing a generous sum in the basket, her lips curved in a tight smile, but the usual murmurs of approval were noticeably absent. Would anyone like to share a testimony? The Reverend asked as the service neared its conclusion. Lucy's small hand unexpectedly rose. The girl stood, her voice barely audible at first. I want to thank those who believed me when I was afraid. A heavy silence fell over the church. Evelyn's face flushed crimson as dozens of eyes turned toward her, then back to the child. I never, Evelyn began, rising to her feet, but the words died on her lips as she faced the collective scrutiny of the town. Something in her broke. You don't understand what it's like, she suddenly cried out. Having her in my home, a constant reminder of his first wife. Perfect Lucy with her drawings and her quiet ways, making me look like the villain when all I've done is try to raise her properly. The congregation sat stunned as years of resentment poured forth in a torrent of bitter words. She's manipulated all of you, just as she manipulates me. The boiling water was an accident, but her screaming was deliberate, to humiliate me, to turn you all against me. Jonathan stood protectively beside Lucy, who trembled but didn't cower. Clara's arm encircled the girl's shoulders. Enough! the Reverend said firmly, approaching Evelyn. "This is not the place for such accusations." But it was too late. The truth had been laid bare before the entire town, not in Lucy's accusations, but in Evelyn's own words, revealing the jealousy and resentment that had fueled her cruelty. As they filed out of the church, the townspeople's eyes held new understanding. For the first time, Lucy walked with her head high, openly believed, while Evelyn faced the consequences of her own unmasking. Margaret Albright surveyed the New Year's gathering with calculating eyes. The town hall glittered with decorations, but her focus remained on Lucy, who stood quietly beside Jonathan in a modest dress. Since Evelyn's church confession, Margaret had watched her cousin's social standing crumble while the millionaire grew increasingly protective of the child. This simply wouldn't do. The perfect opportunity, she whispered to herself, adjusting her expensive necklace before approaching the refreshment table where Lucy was helping serve punch. "Lucy, dear," Margaret called loudly, drawing attention. "I've brought something special for tonight's talent showcase." She produced a folder with a flourish. "Your old drawings from when you stayed with me last summer. Everyone should see your creative imagination." The girl's face paled as Margaret began displaying crude, childish sketches, nothing like Lucy's actual work. These depicted Evelyn as a caring mother and Lucy as angry and violent. Jonathan stepped forward, brow furrowed, but before he could speak, Thomas emerged from the crowd. "Those aren't Lucy's," the baker stated firmly. "I've seen her real artwork." "These are forgeries," Margaret laughed dismissively. What would a shopkeeper know about art? Enough to recognize a desperate attempt at manipulation, Clara replied, joining them. The housekeeper rarely attended social functions, but tonight she stood resolute beside Lucy. Margaret's smile faltered as whispers rippled through the gathering. "I'm only trying to show the truth about this manipulative child." "The truth?" Jonathan's voice carried across the room. "The truth is that you've been spreading lies about a vulnerable child to advance your own social position." Several townspeople nodded, recalling Margaret's suspicious questions and comments about Lucy over recent weeks. "You orchestrated rumors about Thomas's bakery too, didn't you?" asked Mrs. Peterson, the mayor's wife, right after he defended Lucy. Margaret's face flushed crimson. "I was protecting our community from kindness? From honesty?" Jonathan interrupted, placing a protective hand on Lucy's shoulder. The room fell silent as Margaret glanced desperately around, finding only disapproving faces. Her social climbing, once subtle enough to be overlooked, now stood exposed in harsh light. "I think it's time you left," the mayor suggested quietly. As Margaret hurried out, her designer heels clicking against the wooden floor, Lucy exhaled shakily. Thomas offered her a genuine smile, while Clara squeezed her hand. Around them, townspeople approached with gentle words and apologies for believing the worst. In the days that followed, Lucy found herself greeted warmly at school, invited to birthday parties, and welcomed at the marketplace. The town, having witnessed Margaret's cruelty and their own complicity in it, opened their hearts to the child they had once shunned. The summer festival transformed the town square into a wonderland of light and sound. Paper lanterns hung from every lamppost and storefront, casting a warm golden glow across the cobblestone streets. The marketplace, once a stage for whispers and judgment, now pulsed with music and laughter. Lucy stood in the center of it all, her face illuminated by the soft light. Gone was the frightened child who had once cried out in pain. In her place stood a young girl whose smile could outshine the lanterns themselves. She twirled beneath the strings of lights, her movements free and uninhibited. Jonathan Albright watched her with quiet pride. The reserved millionaire who had once feared emotional entanglement now found himself eagerly participating in the festivities. When Lucy pointed to a ribbon seller's stall, he didn't hesitate. "Which color speaks to you?" he asked, his voice gentle. "The blue one," she replied, eyes wide with hope. The philanthropist purchased the ribbon without a second thought, carefully tying it into her hair with fingers that had grown surprisingly adept at such tender tasks. The small gesture carried the weight of a promise that she would never again face cruelty alone. Clara stood nearby, her weathered hands clasped together in quiet joy. The housekeeper caught Jonathan's eye and nodded approvingly. Their shared journey had forged an understanding deeper than employer and employee. They had become family through their protection of Lucy. "I never thought I'd see her laugh like that again," Thomas remarked, joining Clara. The baker's apron still bore traces of flour, having closed his shop early to attend the festival. His bakery, once threatened by gossip and schemes, now thrived as a beloved town establishment. "You played no small part in that," Clara reminded him. "Your kindness gave her sanctuary when she needed it most." As evening deepened, the four of them strolled through the festival together. To onlookers, they might have appeared an unlikely family. The wealthy businessman, the dedicated housekeeper, the hard-working baker, and the blossoming young artist. Yet something profound connected them, something forged through shared struggle and unwavering support. Lucy reached for Jonathan's hand as fireworks began to burst overhead, painting the sky with ephemeral blooms of color. The warmth of her small fingers in his palm reminded him of how far they had come. "Thank you," she whispered, the words nearly lost amid the celebration. Jonathan squeezed her hand gently. "For what?" "For hearing me when no one else would." The summer air carried the scent of sweet treats and possibility. In this moment, beneath the festival lights, the wounds of winter began to truly heal. The belonging they had found in each other outshone even the brightest lantern in the marketplace. The town had changed, and so had everyone in it. Jonathan Albright stood at his study window, watching the marketplace bustle below. His reputation had weathered the storm of gossip, the whispers about his interference in another family's matters, the speculation about his motives. Some still cast sideways glances when he passed, but he carried himself with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. "I never expected defending a child would cost me business partnerships," he admitted to Clara as she brought him tea. "But I'd do it again tomorrow." The housekeeper nodded, her eyes reflecting understanding. Clara had found purpose in her own grief, using her painful past to guide Jonathan toward compassion rather than caution. Her lost child would never return, but in helping Lucy find safety, she had honored that memory in ways she never anticipated. "Some prices are worth paying," she said simply. Across town, Lucy sat sketching in Thomas's bakery, her hands now steady and confident. The burns had healed months ago, but the emotional scars ran deeper. She had endured the humiliation of having her suffering questioned, the isolation when neighbors believed Evelyn's lies. Yet through it all, she had discovered her own voice. "People still ask me if I made it all up," Lucy confided to Thomas as he arranged fresh bread on the shelves. The baker paused, flour dusting his apron. "And what do you tell them?" "The truth," she answered, her voice stronger than it had been before. "Every time." Thomas's business had suffered when he first stood by. Lucy, with many customers avoiding the establishment after Margaret's rumors, but loyalty had ultimately rewarded him. The bakery was now busier than ever, recognized as a place of integrity in a town that had been forced to examine its values. For Evelyn, the cost had been steepest. Stripped of her carefully constructed facade, she now attended weekly counseling sessions at the church. The journey toward honesty about her own childhood wounds had only just begun, but for the first time she was facing her pain rather than inflicting it on others. "Healing isn't linear," the town's minister had told Jonathan when they discussed Evelyn's progress. "But it's possible." As summer settled over the cobblestone streets, the town carried the lessons of winter with it. The price of standing up for truth had been high, relationships tested, reputations questioned, comfort sacrificed. But in the marketplace where Lucy's desperate cry had once pierced the morning air, different sounds now prevailed: conversation, laughter, and the steady rhythm of a community slowly learning to protect its most vulnerable members. The cobblestone marketplace glittered with paper lanterns on the final evening of the summer festival. Lucy stood beside Jonathan Albright, her face illuminated by the golden light, as vendors called out their wares and musicians played cheerful melodies that danced through the warm air. Gone was the frightened child who had once cowered in Evelyn's kitchen. In her place stood a young girl whose eyes sparkled with newfound confidence. "Look at the lantern maker," Lucy said, tugging gently at Jonathan's sleeve. Her voice, once timid and hesitant, now rang clear above the festival's cheerful din. Jonathan smiled, his usually reserved demeanor softened by months of opening his heart. "Would you like to try making one?" he asked, already reaching for his wallet. The millionaire who had once feared the town's judgment now moved easily through the crowd, nodding to neighbors who had witnessed his transformation from distant benefactor to devoted guardian. Clara and Thomas approached, carrying paper cups filled with sweet cider. "I saved you both some of my special apple pastries," Thomas said, handing Lucy a small package wrapped in bakery paper. The young baker's business was thriving now. his kindness to Lucy having earned him the town's loyal patronage. Clara watched with quiet satisfaction as Lucy unwrapped the treat. The housekeeper's wisdom had guided them through the darkest days, her own past grief finding healing in the joy she now witnessed. Across the square, Evelyn stood with a small group of townspeople. The months since her public reckoning had changed her. Though no longer Lucy's guardian, she had begun the painful work of confronting her own childhood wounds. She caught Lucy's eye and offered a small, uncertain nod. Not forgiveness, perhaps, but acknowledgement. Margaret was notably absent, her social ambitions having carried her to another town after her schemes collapsed so publicly. As twilight deepened, the festival orchestra began to play. Without hesitation, Lucy stepped into the circle of dancers, her laughter rising pure and unrestrained into the summer night. Jonathan watched, remembering the desperate cry that had first drawn him to her side on that frigid winter morning. "Your wife would be proud," Clara murmured, standing at his shoulder. "Of both of you." Jonathan nodded, his throat tight with emotion. The letter in his study had led him here, to this moment of belonging that had healed not just Lucy, but himself as well. As stars appeared above the marketplace, Lucy's joy echoed through the town that had once whispered against her. Where suspicion and pain had once ruled, now hope and belonging flourished, living proof that even in the coldest winters, warmth could be found through acts of courage and compassion.